So, wow. All right, that's loud. We're going to get started. Thank you, everybody, for coming along for the... Wow.
What an entrance.
Completely unplanned. I love
found
that.
it. I found it.
Spectacular.
Are we using these?
Yes.
I was in the completely wrong room.
Yeah. So we heard you were like, what? Were you on the main stage?
Told me. I had to go to Titan and go, where am I meant to be? I don't know. And then Jonathan messaged me and I went, oh God, I'm miles away. I need to run.
Well, there we go. So, as I was saying, thank you everyone for coming along to the Newbury Hobbes 10th anniversary panel. I'm Chris Thompson, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce George Mann, the writer and creator of Newbury Hobbes, and Dan Bolwood, who has been working on the comic story with him as well. So we're going to have a bit of a fun discussion. So thanks for joining me, guys.
Thanks for having us.
I guess the first thing I wanted to ask, and if I can start with you, George, in terms of Newbury Hobbes and the origins and where it came from, I guess a lot of it must be built on sort of inspirations and influences you had as a youngster. So what were you into that kind of formed you into the creator you are today?
So this I think I wear my influences on my sleeve with Newbury Hobbes, and there's quite a lot in there, kind of melange of, like you say, all the things that were important to me as a child and a teenager. And I think, well, where Newbury Hobbes came from, when I first started writing and really kind of set out to write a proper novel and sell that novel, I was reading a lot of big science fiction space opera like Peter F. Hamilton, Stephen Baxter, Alistair Reynolds, and I thought, this is where it's at, that's what I need to write. So I set out to write this epic space opera, and inevitably what kept happening was I'd get 6 or 7 chapters in and it would just collapse because I didn't really know what I was doing and I hadn't planned it very well. And I was trying to write something for, I suppose, for cynical reasons, in the sense that I thought I was writing what publishers wanted to read rather than what I wanted to write. And it kept faltering. And I was pretty much ready to give up. And it was a friend of mine, Michael Rowley, who's now an editor, at the time was working at Waterstones, said to me, take a step back, take a breather, remind yourself why you like to write. Write something for you, not for an audience. So I thought, well, that's a good idea. I'm writing it for me, so I'll throw all my influences in. So Hammer horror, Sherlock Holmes, Doctor Who, Stephen Peele from the Avengers, The Dark is Rising, and some kind of classic fantasy novels that I'd read as a child, and kind of threw all that into a mix and started writing this story. And I ended up getting past the 7-chapter curse and carrying on, and I got about halfway through the book and I thought, this is really working, and I sent it to Michael, who little did I know, then sent it on to a publisher that he knew, who then, you know, the next thing I got was a note from the publisher saying, if you we've read the first half of this book, we really like it, if you want to finish it, we'll publish it.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's where it came from, really. So it is very much some of those influences, I think.
But you were already writing other stuff before that, weren't you? So
bits and bobs, yeah. I'd written some short stories, I'd written some novellas, mainly science fiction things. I'd written some kind of Doctor Who spin-off material, and I'd written an encyclopedia of science fiction as well, which was the first published work that I ever did, and was actually a complete nightmare to write. 225,000 words, and nearly broke me.
So what about for you, Dan? Like, we were talking about George's sort of origins in terms of his influences and what inspired him, and you're quite known not just for your incredibly dapper look here, but the way that you bring that sensibility to the page. So whether it be with something like It Came or doing Newbury Hobbes, you have that style, but where did that spring from, and especially in the early days, how did that germinate?
My style? Well, I really hate comics. No. That's where that. I wasn't prepared for that. Yeah, I have to admit, I stopped reading comics almost 20 years ago actually when I started, because everything I read I was influenced by art-wise. So I've only just started again. It's more of a, I just draw when I like to draw, and Newbury Hobbes has been a lot of fun actually. It's been sort of, the last issue with the steam car chase, I'm really enjoying it.
I can't wait to see it.
When I read it, I thought, oh my god. But now I'm drawing it, I'm like, oh, this is really fun. I don't know, developing. You have to go through 7 bouts of depression, I think, before you do something properly. But that's all done. So does that answer it?
Yeah. Well, but what about a younger you, say? Like I kind of like to imagine that the person that formed who you are today. Were you sort of the kid that was watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang at 5 weeks in a balloon and all this sort of thing that established?
I saw the stage play of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang before I saw the film.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, really. And then I watched the film, and I didn't like the film because the film ended with "It's all a dream," but the stage play ends with "No, it's actually happened."
Wow.
Which I thought was better
Yeah.
when I actually watched it. That's a hard. I was a child raised on TV from 30 years before I was born. So,
Right.
carrying films.
Okay.
Rising damp. Stuff. Are you being served? It's
Classic stuff.
Yeah.
I think that's what influences a lot of what I do. Whether or not anyone gets it now, that's a completely different story, but it does influence it.
Well, okay, so coming back to Newbury and Hobbes specifically and how that started out, were you looking to do something in the steampunk genre? Because, at the time when you started, I guess steampunk was really, coming to the fore and getting recognised, 10 years ago. But is that where you were headed? Did you know you were going that way?
No, I think I was very lucky to hit a wave that was starting.
I remember you saying it wasn't steampunk.
Yeah,
when we first met.
I mean, I still maintain that. I don't. I've got nothing against steampunk. I enjoy steampunk.
You haven't actually said it, which I give you massive kudos for, because people say it, and I always think, let people say what it is.
Yeah, no, of course, absolutely. Because once you've written something, it doesn't belong to you anymore. And then if people feel it's steampunk and they want to adopt it as steampunk, then I'm all for it. But I never set out to write steampunk. At the time, it was that process I talked about was just putting my influences in, and I kind of see it as Victorian fantasy. It's got a lot of occult elements to it, but it definitely has the aesthetic of steampunk, and I've borrowed that aesthetic. And I think sometimes I feel a bit guilty in the sense that there's a lot of steam and not a lot of punk. When you look at the steampunk as a fashion movement, it's very much akin to what when I was a kid would have been goths, or 10 years before would have been actual punk.
I was called steampunk the goth retirement village.
because it's got that make and do thing. It is there is a punk and a DIY element to it about individualism.
Absolutely.
And I write about people who are poshos who work for the Queen. So that bit doesn't quite fit with the steampunk definition for me. Although, like as I say, I adore steampunk. I enjoy attending steampunk events and being part of the steampunk community. So I'm not being derogatory in any way. I think it's more that I didn't come from a place of wanting to write steampunk.
Yeah.
It kind of just happened.
Which is probably the better place to come from. And I mean, even if your mindset is still, I'm not writing steampunk, then what you're actually going to do is much purer, and the results aren't forced. You're not trying to fit into a box.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's an airship in the first book, but I definitely don't sit there now writing new Newbury Hobbes stories and thinking, how many cogs can I get in this? I have to have an airship in it.
How many cogs?
I did say cogs.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's like stick a cog in it and call it steampunk.
Yeah, exactly. And you think, no, it's not that. I think Newbury and Hobbes for me has its roots in Victorian fiction. War of the Worlds, Jules Verne, and then Edwardian fiction as well. Things like Algernon Blackwood, the Flaxman Lowe stories, the kind of these early stories about supernatural detectives. And I feel they're as much the root of what I'm doing as something like The Difference Engine or Anubis Gates or kind of those classics of steampunk.
Well, and I think just to give people a little bit of context in terms of what Newbury and Hobbes actually is, because we've sort of talked around it, that it's steampunk, there's airships, there's cogs, there are these characters, Newbury and Hobbes, but if you were sort of giving people the description, you know, who are they, what's the story about, just come back to the basics.
Yeah, so it's essentially, it's set in an alternate version of 1902. So history's started to diverge from real history. Queen Victoria is, instead of dying in 1902, she's been kept alive on a throne. She's been wired into a throne, which is kind of a primitive life support system with bellows and chemicals being pumped into her. And she's trying desperately to cling on to power and maintain the empire. But because she kind of looks hideous these days, she doesn't appear in public anymore. So she lives in a darkened room in Buckingham Palace, and she operates through a series of agents. And there are all sorts of different agents, and we haven't really touched on a lot of them, although there is one that's going to appear in the next novel. But Newbury particularly works for the Queen as a kind of the first line of defence against anything that's strange or occult or weirdly technological. Untoward, exactly that. So he'll go out and the stories usually start with a dead body, like a murder mystery, but there'll be a twist, there'll be something strange about what's happened, and Newbury and Veronica, who began the stories really as his assistant, but now I've come to realise 10 years on is actually the main character of the series, and the backbone of the series is her story. So she's a modern woman out of time. She has a modern viewpoint, but she's just kind of trapped in this Victorian era where she's dealing with being a kind of kick-ass woman who doesn't necessarily want all the gentlemen to hold doors open for her, and she has to deal with those conventions. So that's another nice aspect of it. I'm allowed to kind of examine those sorts of politics and themes in a fantasy novel.
Well, and we'll sort of come back to actually how it originated in becoming a comic, because I'd like to talk about that, but instead we'll just jump ahead for a second, because you reminded me, when you're talking about Queen Victoria there and how she looks and is wired into her chair, I think some of, you know, how you had described her in the books and then actually bringing that to the comic page provided not confusion, but there was an interesting point of view where you had to decide how she looked, because I think Dan's original concept of how she might have been was a little different to yours.
Oh, it was really cool. So Dan gave the throne spider legs, mechanical spider legs, and it was awesome, really awesome. Unfortunately, we'd had kind of 4 or 5 books where we described that she's got wheels on the throne, so we had to go back and kind of make some adjustments so that it felt like it. What I didn't want the comic to be is off to one side, a different interpretation of the characters. It's a brand new story that fits into the theme and the timeline of the novels, so it had to have that kind of authentic element to it. But I mean, I tried to write Victoria as quite sinister, and Dan, I think, really nailed that and really brought that to life and added a new dimension. Yeah, I mean, when I now write about Victoria, I see her from those panels, you know, with the withering finger pointing at Newbury, and I think that's Victoria. That's how she is in the books. So yeah, I think that's been a brilliant element of working with Dan on the comics, seeing these things brought to life, and you know, the steam carriages and things like that, steam-powered carriages that run around London. Again, I've described them, but now I've got a visual aid as well.
Yes.
That Dan's provided. So yeah, it's absolutely influencing the stuff that's coming afterwards.
So how about for you, Dan, when you were sort of approaching it, how much were you reliant on what had come before to inform how you drew it, and how much were you approaching the scripts that you were getting as something fresh and going, how would I interpret that visually without sort of too much baggage as such?
Because I read the books and I loved them, and I thought they were great, but I always come into things with how I want to see it. So I will take seconds. It's like with the spider leg sort of throw. But it's always, I think it's like I've just drawn a steam-powered omnibus, which is insane, because the point where it's set is there there is an element of real life in it, because at the point in 1902 there were steampunk vehicles. There was, I mean, from the late 1800s there were perambulators. Well, not ambulators, they would call them that's a pram. There were already relevant examples of what would have been existing, but then it's taking those, changing them to the point where they're bordering on fantastical, but not, still practical. That's the thing, I always say there's the massive difference between steampunk and dieselpunk. Whereas dieselpunk, you just cover it in chrome and nobody cares, it's fine. But steampunk, it has to look like it works. And that's the sort of way I approach things like that. The mechanisms, at least in the book, was it has to look like it works. Which is lots of fun to draw, yet also a nightmare as well, because you're having to constantly, you're having to put on an engineer's head at the same time. So it's difficult. I can't remember what the question was. I've had a couple of gins before this panel, to be honest.
Only a couple of
Well
done.
With the context of the...
Only 6 or 7, it's fine.
It fits with it. We really should have had them on stage here as well with us, as opposed to water.
I shed a singular tear that there wasn't gin.
Or
this
is it water? You know, I guess that is the question.
It should be called Newbury and Hobbes Mother's Ruin. That's what it should be called.
It's method, isn't it? You know, you're trying to live as Newbury.
I try. I haven't developed he doesn't have an opium addiction, as far as I'm aware, but I try one.
It's an ongoing opium addiction he's got.
So I guess from your side, George, what was Dan bringing? You know, aside from sort of doing different things with the spider legs, in some way you'd be like, actually, it's got to be like this. Were there things that you brought where you were like, do you know what, that realizes this thing perfectly? It's not how I imagined it, but it is now, basically.
Tons of it. I mean, so when I'm writing, I tend to be focused on the characters, and what Dan's doing so well is filling in the backgrounds around those characters as well. So it's about bringing the world into the fore as well, and that's you know, the little touches, the things that are happening in the street behind the characters, all add to that kind of that sense of immersion.
I'm going for that. It's the really early days of this technology, so it's not. That's why I put horse and carts. I like the juxtaposition between horse and cart and steam carts as well. So they're still using horse and carts.
Absolutely.
There's still steam. There's these newfangled, and none of them look the same. Because it was the same thing when old sort of hackney carriages. That each company would have a different design. Because they're just building their own thing, so each steam carriage looks sort of different because it's not a set design yet. It's still very much a what's the word I'm looking for? Burgeoning technology.
Yeah, and that's adding a real level of authenticity that I wouldn't necessarily, because in the characters are so used to steam-powered carriages that they get in them, and they don't necessarily have to describe them again. And you know, in the novels, Veronica hates them. She hates them with passion. They make her feel sick. She wants to go by horse and cars.
Right.
And Newbury is always in a rush to get to the crime scene before the body starts to decompose or whatever. So he's always like, no, we're taking the steam power carriage. So there's that tension between that. So I'm always thinking about that. And what Dan's bringing is that authenticity about actually these vehicles could look like this, and there are different companies making them, or you know, different operators, and it's going to have a different look and feel. And I think that it just adds depth.
I think that's the beauty of these kind of discussions, where you can get that little sort of behind the scenes look and those Easter eggs that might otherwise be lost, because you're putting the attention to detail into the art there, you're throwing things into the background if people are paying attention, but sometimes they just get so caught up in the story or the characters that they're not paying attention. You almost take for granted that there's all this other scenery in a comic, but you're just following the main story and missing all these extra elements that you've thrown in where everything's different.
But if you didn't draw the scenery, people would notice that too.
Oh, yeah, it totally
So
would. You have to do it, and it adds so much, I think.
Yeah.
There's the scene where I think it's in the first issue where they're going into some laboratories, and I can't even remember what the script says, but it's probably along the lines of a laboratory with lots of sinister things going on in it, and Dan puts things in jars around it and adds layers of dust and strange tools and things, and you think, well, that's bringing it to life.
Yes, absolutely, and it's grounding things, so that what you're telling with the characters makes sense, that there are established rules of this world, that you know, it's, you can accept that, and therefore you accept what's happening in the story.
Absolutely.
It goes back to the guy who, I wouldn't necessarily say taught me comics, but I did a comics course years ago. He always said that you can not draw street lights, but if you don't draw them, people will notice they're not there. So you have to make the world a tangible place. So you have to put those little things in it that make it a place. Otherwise, and you could the stuff you draw. I could draw it, and I think I could probably not draw this, but someone will notice. It creates the full form in their head.
Yes.
What the setting is. So if you don't do it, it saves time, but it's
Taking
it
shortcuts.
ultimately takes a lot out of that world. So it's good to have that world. I hate drawing streetlights, but I'll draw them down. I don't like them.
So I guess coming back to the origins of it, you know, the comic series is not adaptations of the novels. These are brand new stories that are, you know, taking place in that world. So if you've already read the novels, then they're adding extra sort of background and layer and story to them, but they can be read on their own as well.
Yeah.
How did they actually come about? Because I know these have been in development for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, they're actually the first comic scripts I ever wrote, and I apologise for that now, because I've learned a lot since about how to write comics and how to work in a visual medium, but yeah, I mean, it was the early days of Titan Comics, basically. Titan had just taken on the novels, the Newbury Hobbes novels, and I'd been making some small press comics, basically, just with a few artists that I've known, just trying to do very short Newbury Hobbes pieces. And I showed one of them to Nick and Viv from Titan, who said, we'd be interested in doing we're starting a comics division, you know. So we then entered into some discussions about what form that could take, and from the off, I think we were all very clear that it would be an original story. We didn't want to do something that was just retelling the same story that readers had already experienced in the novels. So I set about, I knew the language of comics as a reader, but not as a writer, so I kind of set about working up these scripts, and wrote them in a kind of white hot month of just going at it with nothing else.
Sorry, these are really like a lightsaber.
Yeah, and then, you know, I think, as I say, it was the early days of Titan Comics. They were still finding their feet in terms of what artists they were working with, what they could offer. But they'd been working with Dan on It Came, and I'd read It Came, and when Steve said to me, Dan's gonna, you know, he's up for doing the artwork, I bowled over because I thoroughly enjoyed It Came.
As long as he doesn't put so many penis jokes in there, that'll be fine.
But
I guess it's all about inserting the right sort of knobs into the background of the series.
Inserting and knobs. That was great. Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, I think my first thought really for what the Newbury Hobbes comic should look like was very different from what we've done, in the sense that I imagined it to be quite gothic, quite dark, lots of shadowy panels, different colour schemes, you know, quite dark reds, and almost kind of verging on kind of the look and feel of a horror comic, I suppose, is what I had in my head. And Dan is obviously the other end of the spectrum from that. But actually, I wouldn't change a thing. I think what Dan's done is really bring the characters and their world to life, and almost it almost feels to me like it's a Saturday morning cartoon.
I do kind of think more from a comedy perspective. That's how I usually approach it. I've kind of tried to go for a sort of green hue. I always see the fog as very green for some reason.
I think the fog in those days was yellowy green, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's what I try and go for in it. But then the first issue is very much a sort of testing out that world in the way that it's stride in two, where it is darker and it's a bit sort of foggier, and the light effects and things.
But the story gets darker as well, so you're tracking that.
Does,
So it was Steve White, the editor, who originally brought you guys together and working on that. I mean, it's interesting just to give you a bit of context as well. If we're talking about the 10th anniversary of Newbury and Hobbes, it's now the 5th anniversary of Titan Comics this year. So essentially, it was halfway into its lifespan that this comic sort of germinated, and now it's literally only this year we're finally seeing it.
It's had a very long gestation period, and hopefully people are going to feel it's worth it as well. I think you can see that in the pages and in Dan's art and the way it's come together. You know, and hopefully long may it continue.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned before that in writing Newbury and Hobbes, you sort of discovered that Hobbes was essentially the main character. You know, you hadn't maybe set out that way, but she had asserted herself and come to the fore.
She's the everyman.
Absolutely that. She's the everyman, and I just think she's got the most interesting story as well. Her journey, the things she has to face, the decisions she has to make about Newbury and how she feels about Newbury and her relationship with the Queen and her family. You know, she's got a sister at the start of the books who's locked in an asylum, having these episodes, these kind of horrible fits that are in some ways kind of clairvoyant. And Newbury's the only one who can see that. Everyone else just thinks that she should be locked in this asylum because she's mad. So she's got this interesting journey of basically our viewpoint on the empire, on kind of gender politics, on the occult, and then she faces some very difficult choices when the Queen does things in the story that affect her sister, and Newbury does things to help her sister that negatively affect him, and you know, she's torn between these situations. How can she possibly choose between her sister and Newbury, and which one survives or which one you know, she loves more, I suppose. So she's got it's a big story arc for Veronica.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned before that you had already done some comic strips, and you know, before you actually did the Newbury and Hobbes comic and started all that time ago. And I'd read that you also did a Newbury and Hobbes annual at one point, sort of emulating those ones that you would get at Christmas time when you were a kid. So were those the strips that you were showing originally as sort of proof of concept?
One of them was, yeah. So there's one that's never seen the light of day, which is kind of a 12-page story, which we might do something with one day. And there's a black and white strip that's in that annual, yeah. And the annual came out, because I've got a friend who runs a small press, and he really, really wanted to do something Newbury and Hobbes, and I had a few Christmas stories knocking about, and a little idea for a little board game and a few things. So he said, well, let's do a Christmas annual. So he literally printed 100 copies of them and sold them all that day. But it's good fun. It's got a little short comic strip in it. It's 3 or 4 short stories, and the centre pages are a little board game where you can get chased by revenants around the pages.
Right.
So it's good fun.
I guess there was a lot of you know, the seeds for what you would do later in that annual, by the sound of things, because obviously you wanted to play with the comic strip, which then has become a fully fledged comic now and will be collected as a graphic novel soon. But then there's also the fact you mentioned a board game. And there is a board game that's in development for Newbury and Hobbes.
Yeah, it's a fully fledged board game with kind of busts of all the main characters, and it's another new story. So as you can take on the roles of the main characters and investigate a mysterious cult that's having an influence over London, and that's in development now with a guy who just wrote a Hellboy board game, which did very, very well on Kickstarter. And a miniatures designer who used to work for Games Workshop. So we've got a good team, and that's, I think, going to go into Kickstarter in May.
Right.
That's a pretty good team.
Yeah,
that Hellboy game is fantastic.
Yeah, I backed that to the hilt and spent a fortune on it. So yeah, I'm hoping it's not going to have as many miniatures. We're doing it slightly differently. They'll be like Victorian style busts of the main characters. But I'm really excited about that. Yeah.
So is there any of the, say, artwork from the comic or even some of Dan's designs that's going into inspiring the board games, you know?
Yeah, I think absolutely that. Certainly from the design point of view. I'm not sure how the artwork's going to pan out yet. That's all still part of the development process. I'd like to think so. And Dan and I have talked about doing other things as well. Perhaps doing a card game using some of his artwork as well. So because I've got a gamer's soul. I enjoy card games and tabletop games, so I've got some ideas how a card game could work for Newbury Hobbes. And last time we were in the pub, we were shooting the breeze, and that might come to something. So that's another possibility for the future.
Sipping gin in teacups and talking about the future games
Absolutely,
you develop
yes.
together.
Sipping gin. Sip gin.
Hey, I don't judge how you drink it.
I had to have a very in-depth conversation with a man in the pub outside about how to do gin on the rocks, which was very upsetting. He went, ice? Yes, that's...
I'm sure
that's a whole other discussion about how you drink gin.
That's a whole other panel. Is a connoisseur of gin, the panel.
It's a one-man show, I can see it now.
There's only going to be one person there, yes.
With a giant bottle of gin. and I guess the other thing that has been really interesting with Newbury Hobbes is you've got a soundtrack for it. I think it's for the first novel.
At the moment for the first novel, but there are 2 more albums to come. So this is an American composer called Brad Hoyt, who wrote to me out of the blue. Actually, he said, "I've read your books and I've written some music inspired by them. Here you go." And it was amazing, proper scores, like film scores.
It's really good. I listened to it.
Yeah,
it's really
like
good.
while you're drawing, you listen to.
Yeah, it really fits. It's good.
And I listen to it while I'm writing now. So Brad originally said, "Can I do a few more?" So I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "Is there anything you'd like to see?" And I said, "Well, I'd love a theme tune as if it was an old TV show." So we did a theme tune, and then he started doing more and more. And then he said, "Can I release an album?" And we said, "Yeah, of course." So we arranged a kind of formal license so that he could call it a Newbury Hobbes album. And initially it was just going to be one album. And then he kind of came to me fairly recently and said, "I've overshot by about 30 tracks. So how about we do an album per book?" I was like, okay. So he's released now a soundtrack album for The Infinity Bridge, which is the first novel. He's got the next one queued up, coming out in the next couple of months. A third one queued up. And then he's going to start work on the 4th, 5th and 6th book and do a whole cycle of all the books.
So does that mean he's going to get ahead of you book-wise?
No, I think he'll wait. I mean, I'm not that... I mean, we've had a big gap between books 4 and 5. But book 5 is out in February and book 6 is already underway. So that's out the following year. So he'll be fine. He's going to do them in 2 sets.
I'd love it if it got to the whole Jeff Wayne's Newbury Hobbes.
That would be amazing, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it?
Well, and that's almost sort of what I was going to ask as far as the next stage, because you've got scripts where you've generated a comic script, which is so different to, say, the novelization or the novels, and then you've got a soundtrack. Are you looking at the prospect of audio dramas as another step?
I'd love to do audio dramas, yeah. I've had lots of conversations with people about it, and I have a producer who's interested, but incredibly busy with lots of kind of radio shows that he's working on. So Live action. So it was optioned for television once, and it got really close actually. But the problem was cost, because it's a £5 million episode thing to make. It's period drama and it's special effects. But there is. I mean, these things come and go. There's a very big TV and film company interested at the moment, so we're in talks. It hasn't become a formal option yet. But these things can happen, so I keep my fingers crossed. I would love to see it on TV one day. I think it would be more of a TV show than a movie for me.
Right.
Just for the variety of story that we've already got within the Newbury Hobbes canon with the short stories and the novels and the comics.
It's better to have that type of setup as well, with like a film length to cram it in.
Yeah, exactly that.
In a series, you can space that out really nicely.
Really follow the character arc through. So I'd love to see it turn into a TV series. And we keep plugging. But in the meantime, I mean, I think I see my job as continuing to tell more Newbury and Hobbes stories for people who want to read them, be that novels or comics, and hopefully in the future audios. Lots of interesting stuff. I mean, I've got a little project just in the works at the moment, which is 100-word stories. So they're all exactly 100 words, and I'm doing 31 of them for December to be like an advent calendar.
Wow.
And each one's a little self-contained story that you can read each day throughout December. So trying to find different ways to tell Newbury and Hobbes stories.
So those are all Newbury and Hobbes related?
They're all
then?
Newbury and Hobbes, yeah.
Wow.
And overall they build into one bigger story over the course of the month.
So I was reading somewhere that originally you had envisioned it as about 6 novels. Like, is that still the case? And you're going, well, it's 6 novels, but it could be all these other bits and pieces and other things to add around that? Or have you sort of expanded that view and you're like, I don't know how long it is now?
I think the latter, to be honest. There's a spine of 6 books, which is I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't read the stories yet, but there's a spine of 6 books that are the core of Veronica's arc, basically. That we meet her for the first time in the first novel, and by the end of the last novel, she's been fundamental in changing the situation in a way that affects the wider empire. Hopefully there'll be opportunity to tell more stories within that framework as well, so I can always drop in short stories and more comics. I've now written a short story about, and a few references about Newbury's previous companion, assistant, before Veronica, so I think there's stories to be told there about what happened to him and how he died a horrible death. That's already been established, so we can tell some stories about how that happened. And then I think there is probably stories to be told after the 6th book as well,
right?
With a slightly different setup. So their relationship with the Queen will be very different, put it that way. Assuming people want to keep reading them, that's the thing. I think I could keep writing Newbury and Hobbes stories forever if people want to keep reading them. So
right,
I have a notebook full of ideas for stories, and every time I need to write a new story, I just flip through it and find one and think, right, it's time to tell that story.
And how about for you, Dan? You're working on Newbury and Hobbes still at the moment, and so finishing up the series. How is that coming along, and what else are you working on or looking forward to doing next?
How's it coming along?
Yeah.
It's going to get done in time for the deadline. So that's all that matters.
Right.
No, it's good. I've really enjoyed it. It's been it's fun because I come from more of a sort of comedy background of comics. So I like writing sort of sardonic knob jokes, basically. So it's been outside of my comfort zone for a lot of it. It's been a real development Newbury and Hobbes as well from there, because it's been a while since I started this, but it's because of the whole sort of situation behind it. So I've watched my art develop over time as it's been going on. And it's been, I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, I'd be happy to crack on with some more. That sounds like a good thing to do. So it's, let's see these characters again doing things. I like doing fog. It's, I wish I hadn't had so many gins before I started this. What was the question?
Well, it was finding out where you were up to, how you were enjoying it, and I guess did you have any other plans next? So is there something that you're really itching to do yourself?
Next. Well, I don't know if anyone in the now slightly larger audience remembers, but many years ago I did a book called It Came, which was a comedy B-movie book. But I myself and young Jonathan Stevenson, who's sitting in the audience there, will be co-writing a sequel, not sequel, to this book.
Right.
It's a different film in the same genre, starring the same people, but as their actors who are playing different parts. And I'm looking forward to getting back into that, because that's the sort of, I just like irreverent comedy things. I don't think there's enough of that in comics, to be honest, these days. I think it's quite seriously sad, and I like a bit of something you can read on the toilet for half an hour. That's alright, isn't it? So.
It Came was fantastic. I can't wait to see what you're doing next.
Oh, thanks. That was a weird labour of love. It Came. That was coming out of a very dark time, and someone said to me, just write what you know, and I thought, all I know is rubbish. So I'm gonna write some sort of comedy stuff. But it's, yeah, I like comedy comics. I think I'm looking forward to sort of doing some more of that. We should be coming up for that. So it's making people laugh, or not, or making them angry. And it made a few people angry. That was okay. You know? As long as you've elicited an emotional response, I think you've succeeded in art. To be honest, so it's fine.
Now we do have literally a couple of minutes. Was there anyone that had any burning questions where you're like, I really want to know about this, and you know, this guy has not asked, so I need to find out?
Or have lots of you come in for the next panel?
Getting primo seats, you know.
I know what's going on.
No, that's all right. I hope then that means that we've really covered it all for you, but please do go check out the novels. So as George said, there are currently 4 Newbury and Hobbes.
Fifth one in February.
New people who came in, go and buy the Newbury and Hobbes comics. They're in the Forbidden Planet stand.
Exactly, yes. And, you know, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dan, for coming along, George, and thank you for being here as we talk about knobs and cogs and the wonderful world of Newbury and Hobbes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.